Brian Wilson, the genius who heard voices. He was deaf in one ear. He produced the greatest pop album ever made, in mono, because he had no choice. His father beat him so badly he lost 90% of hearing on the right side, then sold his songs without telling him. He had a breakdown on an airplane at 22. He heard voices in his head every day for 40 years. He spent 2.5 years in bed at over 300 pounds. His psychologist padlocked his refrigerator, took songwriting credit on his albums, and cut off his family for 9 years. The woman who rescued him from that psychologist married him. When she died, he couldn't care for himself. A court placed him under conservatorship, the second of his life. His brother drowned at 39. His other brother died of cancer at 51. He finished his masterpiece 37 years late. He died in his sleep at 82. Paul McCartney called one of his songs the greatest ever written. The voices never stopped. The albums, the breakdowns, and the diagnoses are real. What people still argue about is whether the illness destroyed the genius, or whether the genius was the illness finding its way out. This is Brian Wilson's real story. The boy his father broke. Brian Wilson was born on June 20th, 1942 in Inglewood, California. The family moved to Hawthorne when he was 2. His father, Murry Wilson, ran a small machining company and spent his evenings writing songs nobody wanted to record. He had lost his left eye in an industrial accident. When he wanted to frighten his sons, he would remove the glass replacement and force the boys to stare into the empty socket. The physical abuse was routine. Murry beat Brian and his younger brothers, Dennis and Carl, with boards, with his fists, with whatever was nearby. Sometime before Brian's 3rd birthday, the exact cause remains disputed. He lost roughly 90% of hearing in his right ear. His cousin Mike Love said their mother told him Murry had struck Brian in the head. Brian gave different accounts over the years. The result was the same. The boy who would become one of the most important producers in music history could never hear in stereo. But Murry also loved music. He gathered the family around a Hammond organ on evenings when they couldn't afford to go out. Brian absorbed everything. He could reproduce melodies after a single listen. He taught himself piano and was teaching his brothers 3-part harmony before he was a teenager. Dennis later said their father would cry when he heard the music. The man who beat them senseless would weep with joy when they sang. In 1961, at Dennis's suggestion, he was the only one who actually served, the brothers formed a band in the family garage with cousin Mike Love and classmate A.L. Jardine. A record promoter changed their name from the Pendletones to the Beach Boys without asking. Their first single became a local hit. Murry became their manager. The cycle that would define Brian Wilson's life had begun. Someone who loved him and hurt him was now in control of his career. The breakdown at 30,000 feet. By late 1964, Brian Wilson was 22 and carrying the entire Beach Boys operation alone. He wrote the songs, arranged them, produced them, sang lead, played bass, toured, and handled business. He called himself Mr. Everything, and meant it as a confession, not a boast. On December 18, 1964, the band boarded a flight from Los Angeles to Houston for a 2-week tour. Somewhere over the desert, Brian began sobbing uncontrollably. His bandmates had never seen anything like it. He played the Houston show that night, then told them he was done touring. Session guitarist Glenn Campbell was brought in as his road replacement. Brian later called it the first of 3 breakdowns, but it was also a liberation. With the band on tour, he was alone in the studio, free from his bandmates' skepticism, free from his father's interference. He fired Murry as manager in April 1964. Murry still showed up at sessions drunk, berating the band during one recording of Help Me Rhonda for nearly 40 minutes. But the power dynamic had shifted. Brian began spending days and nights at Western Recorders and Gold Star Studios, working with the Wrecking Crew, the elite session musicians behind Phil Spector's records. Hal Blaine on drums, Carol Kaye on bass, Glenn Campbell on guitar. These conservatory-trained professionals were astonished by Wilson. Unlike most producers, he wrote out every note for every instrument himself. Carol Kaye later recalled that Wilson understood the tones and timbres possible from a single instrument in a way few composers did. He was 22, deaf in one ear, and directing musicians twice his age who had played on hundreds of hits. And then he heard Rubber Soul, the album that changed everything. In late 1965, Brian Wilson listened to Rubber Soul while smoking marijuana with friends. The album shattered something inside him. He rushed to his wife Marilyn and announced he was going to make the greatest rock album ever made. Not a collection of singles, an album, a unified emotional statement from beginning to end. He spent the next 4 months producing Pet Sounds. The other Beach Boys were largely reduced to vocalists. Brian built the instrumental tracks almost entirely with the Wrecking Crew across 27 sessions. He used instruments that had never appeared on a rock record: electro theremin, harpsichord, bicycle horns, empty Coca-Cola cans as percussion, bass harmonica, strings, French horns. On the session for God Only Knows, later called the greatest song ever written by Paul McCartney, there were so many musicians crammed into Western Studio 3 that Carl had to play his guitar part from the control room. There was physically no space for him. Tony Asher, an advertising copywriter, wrote the lyrics. The songs were about loneliness, inadequacy, the terror of growing up. I just wasn't made for these times might as well have been Brian's autobiography. He was producing the most sophisticated pop music in history while hearing voices nobody else could hear, composing in mono because his right ear was dead. Pet Sounds was released on May 16, 1966. It peaked at number 10 in the United States. Mike Love thought it was uncommercial. Capitol Records was confused. In England, Bruce Johnston brought an acetate to London and played it for Lennon, McCartney, and Keith Moon. They were awestruck. McCartney later said, Pet Sounds directly inspired SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Brian's wife Marilyn said the album's underwhelming American reception reminded him of failing, and then he was more tortured. Rolling Stone now ranks Pet Sounds as the second greatest album of all time. But here's the part that reframes everything. Brian Wilson mixed the entire album in mono, not as a stylistic choice, because he had no idea what stereo sounded like. The man who changed the sound of recorded music never actually heard his own records the way the rest of the world did. The single that cost more than most albums. While finishing Pet Sounds, Brian was simultaneously working on something even more ambitious, a single called Good Vibrations. The concept came from a childhood memory. His mother told him dogs bark at some people and not others because they sense vibrations, good and bad. The idea scared him as a boy. As a producer, he turned it into a 3-minute and 35-second symphony. The recording consumed 17 sessions across 4 studios: Gold Star, Western Recorders, Sunset Sound, and CBS Columbia Square, each chosen for its specific acoustics. Over 30 musicians participated. 90 hours of tape were used. Brian recorded dozens of short musical fragments, then spliced them together like a film editor assembling scenes. The cost reached between $50,000 and $75,000, roughly what the entire Pet Sounds album had cost. In 1966, dollars, more than $500,000 today. Good Vibrations hit number 1 in both the United States and the United Kingdom. It became the Beach Boys' best-selling single. Band publicist Derek Taylor called it a pocket symphony. It is ranked among the greatest recordings in the history of popular music. Brian had proven he could hear things nobody else could and build them from tape and wire. And that's when he decided to make something even bigger. That decision nearly destroyed him. A symphony he couldn't finish. The follow-up to Pet Sounds was supposed to be called Smile. Brian described it as a teenage symphony to God. He recruited session musician and lyricist Van Dyke Parks to write the words. The concept was vast and strange. An American musical landscape stretching from Plymouth Rock to the Pacific, incorporating elements of Americana, comedy, prayer, and experimentation that had no precedent in popular music. The sessions began in late 1966. Brian booked marathon recording dates with battalions of session musicians. He was using LSD heavily. The music was astonishing and unstable. Fragments of brilliance connected by his increasingly fragile mental state. During the recording of a track called Fire, intended to evoke buildings burning, Brian wore a fire helmet in the studio. A real fire broke out in a building nearby that same day. Brian became convinced his music had caused it. He destroyed the tapes. Van Dyke Parks left the project. Mike Love was hostile to the concept. Capitol Records demanded a finished product. Brian's expanding social circle, described by one television producer as a playpen of irresponsible people, was pulling him in every direction. By mid-1967, Smile was abandoned. In its place, the band released Smiley Smile, a stripped-down, hazy record that bore almost no resemblance to the masterpiece Brian had envisioned. It peaked at number 41. The collapse of Smile broke something in Brian Wilson that would take 37 years to repair. The album that was supposed to prove he was the greatest composer of his generation instead became proof that he was losing his mind. And in the silence that followed, the voices in his head got louder. The father who sold his son's future. While Brian retreated, his father made one final devastating move. In November 1969, Murry Wilson sold Sea of Tunes, the publishing company he and Brian had co-founded in 1962 to hold the rights to every Beach Boys song, to Irving Almo Music for $700,000. He did it without consulting Brian or any other band member. He believed the Beach Boys' best years were behind them and that the catalog's value had peaked. Brian was devastated. His wife Marilyn later said the sale killed him emotionally. He didn't speak for days. He later wrote that his father had taken the only thing he knew would last and sold it like a garage sale. Brian's signature was on the documents, but he later claimed it may have been forged while he was incapacitated by mental illness. In the decades that followed, that catalog generated over $100 million in royalties. Not a cent went to Brian or his bandmates. Murry Wilson died of a heart attack on June 4, 1973 at 55. He never apologized. He left behind 3 sons. One retreating into psychosis, one spiraling into addiction, one trying to hold the band together, and a catalog of their life's work that belonged to strangers. Brian sued for fraud and settled for $10 million. The catalog was estimated at $40 million at the time. Mike Love sued separately and won $13 million. The songs Murry sold for $700,000 are now worth several hundred million. The man who beat his son, deaf in one ear, also ensured his son would never fully own the music that deafness helped create. The bed, the sand, and the voices. The 1970s were a slow drowning. Brian Wilson's drug use escalated from marijuana and LSD into cocaine, heroin, and alcohol. His weight ballooned past 300 pounds. He was photographed in public wearing nothing but a bathrobe, eyes vacant. He ordered 8 truckloads of sand dumped into his living room around his piano. He wanted to feel the beach beneath his feet while he played. By the early 1980s, he had been confined to his bed for roughly 2.5 years. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was schizoaffective disorder, a condition producing hallucinations, depression, paranoia, and mania. Brian heard voices constantly, not occasionally, every day, all day, for over 40 years. He later told an interviewer that the auditory hallucinations were in his head all day, every day, and he couldn't get them out. He described them as cruel, taunting, relentless. His first wife, Marilyn Wilson, couldn't hold the marriage together. They separated in 1978. Brian couldn't assume a parental role for their daughters Carney and Wendy, who would later form Wilson Phillips. He had written God Only Knows, a song about the terror of losing someone, and then lost everyone close to him because he couldn't control what was happening inside his skull. The man Leonard Bernstein had called one of today's most important musicians was a recluse who couldn't dress himself. The bed was the only place that didn't ask him to be Brian Wilson, the doctor who became the disease. In 1975, Marilyn called Eugene Landy, a psychologist known for unconventional 24-hour therapy. Their first session took place in Brian's bedroom closet, where Brian felt safest. Landy padlocked the refrigerator, enforced a strict diet, and drove away drug-enabling friends. It worked. Brian lost weight and produced 15 big ones in 1976. His first production credit since Pete Sounds. Then Landy raised his monthly fee to $20,000 and was fired. Brian immediately relapsed. The drugs returned. The weight returned. The bed returned. In 1982, he nearly died from a combined overdose of alcohol and cocaine. His family, desperate, brought Landy back. This time, Landy consumed him. He surrounded Brian with round-the-clock handlers, one nicknamed Surf Nazi by the family. He banned contact with Brian's mother, brother Carl, and daughters. He controlled Brian's medications, schedule, meals, and music. By the mid-1980s, Landy told a magazine he influenced all of Brian's thinking and was practically a member of the band. When Brian's self-titled solo debut was released in 1988, Landy's name appeared as co-writer on 5 songs and executive producer. He formed a joint business venture called Brains and Genius. He stood to inherit up to 70% of Brian's fortune. Brian later told an interviewer that Landy wouldn't let him talk to his family for 9 years. The rescue came from Melinda Ledbetter, a woman who had sold Brian a Cadillac at a car dealership and discovered the quiet, shuffling man she was falling for was controlled by his own psychologist. Melinda worked with Brian's family to file a conservatorship petition. In 1992, a court barred Landy from contacting Brian. Landy's therapy had cost approximately $3 million. His medical license was later revoked. Brian's later reflections were complicated. He credited Landy with saving his life, but added, "I thought he was my friend, but he was a very messed up man." The brothers who didn't survive. Brian Wilson outlived both of his brothers. Neither death was peaceful. On December 28, 1983, Dennis Wilson, the only Beach Boy who actually surfed, the wild middle brother who had befriended Charles Manson, drowned in Marina del Rey. He was 39. He'd been drinking vodka since 9 that morning. His blood alcohol level was .26. He'd been diving off a friend's boat, trying to recover belongings he'd thrown overboard during his divorce years earlier. He went under and didn't come back up. Ronald Reagan personally intervened to grant Dennis a burial at sea, an honor normally reserved for military veterans. His body was lowered into the Pacific. The only Beach Boy who loved the water died in it. Carl Wilson, the youngest brother, the quiet one who had sung God Only Knows at 16 and held the band together for decades, was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1997. He continued touring while undergoing chemotherapy. On February 6, 1998, Carl died in Los Angeles at 51. His mother Audrey had died just 2 months earlier. Brian, the eldest, the most fragile, the one everyone expected to go first, was now the last Wilson brother. The band that started with three brothers singing harmony in a Hawthorne garage had lost two of those voices forever. The smile that took 37 years. The comeback nobody expected began with a woman. Melinda Ledbetter married Brian Wilson in 1995. She gave him the emotional stability he said he had never had. She managed his medication. She managed his career. She stood between him and anyone who wanted to exploit him. Brian credited her with giving him the security to have a career again. In 1999, Brian tentatively returned to the stage. The shows were fragile. His voice was weathered. His speech sometimes wandered. But the audiences were hushed and reverent, as if watching a man return from the dead. Because in many ways, they were. Then, in 2004, Brian did the thing everyone had given up on. He completed Smile. Not the Beach Boys version, that was gone. He reassembled it from scratch with a new band, re-recording every track, finishing every fragment that had haunted him for 37 years. Brian Wilson Presents. Smile was released to the best reviews of his career. The track Mrs. O'Leary's Cow, the one that had sent him spiraling into paranoia in 1967, won a Grammy for Best Rock Instrumental. The teenager who had promised a symphony to God delivered it at 62 after decades of psychosis, addiction, exploitation, and grief. He continued touring through 2022, supported by a band that adjusted to his pace and a wife who never left his side. In 2007, Brian received the Kennedy Center honors. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988 and the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 2000. The 2014 biopic Love and Mercy, starring John Cusack and Paul Dano, dramatized both his creative peak and his imprisonment under Landy. It was named after the most beautiful song on his 1988 solo album, the one Landy had put his name on. Brian Wilson spent the first half of his life hearing music that didn't exist yet and building it from nothing. He spent the second half trying to survive everything that came with being the person who could hear it. Deaf in one ear from a beating before he turned 3. The first pop musician to write, arrange, produce, and perform his own material. Pet Sounds at 23. Good Vibrations at 24. 17 sessions, 4 studios, 90 hours of tape. The most expensive single ever recorded. Number 1, Smile at 25. And then The Voices won. His father sold his songs for $700,000. They're now worth hundreds of millions. His psychologist took his freedom for $3 million and 9 years of silence. His brother Dennis drowned at 39. His brother Carl died of cancer at 51. His first wife left. His second wife saved him. And when she died in January 2024, he couldn't care for himself without her. On June 11, 2025, Brian Wilson died in his sleep at his Beverly Hills home. He was 82. The cause was respiratory arrest. He had been living with dementia. A court had placed him under conservatorship, the second of his life. He left behind 7 children, a catalog of unreleased work, and a body of music that every important songwriter of the last 60 years has cited as foundational. He composed the most intricate harmonies in the history of popular music with one working ear. He lost everything: his hearing, his brothers, his songs, his autonomy, his mind, and still found his way back to the piano. The voices never stopped, but neither did the music. And if you want the full story of the Smile sessions, how a 24-year-old genius tried to build a teenage symphony to God, how a fire convinced him his music could destroy the world, and why it took 37 years to finish, subscribe. That's coming next.